Well, welcome everybody. I'm here with Laura to talk about some of the remedial design work that EPA is undertaking. So if you want to go ahead and take me to the next slide, that'd be great. We're hoping that you come away understanding a little bit more about the status and the future of the EPA design work within Portland Harbor. And at the end, we'll touch on our past, current, and future work on job training opportunities for the Portland Harbor site. And we also will have plenty of time to ask questions. So we'll pause throughout the presentation, as Alyssa mentioned, and then we'll be in a breakout room after if we run out of time. Next slide. So I want to start with kind of a foundational piece of the way the Superfund law operates. There are two types of cleanups that EPA is a part of. There's the kind that are led by potentially responsible parties. And this is where we have a viable entity that has some liability for the pollution, that then the law allows us to work with that party to get it cleaned up. If there is no viable party that has any liability, then EPA can self-fund a cleanup, and then that cleanup is considered a fund lead cleanup. Portland Harbor is a potentially responsible party-led cleanup. The majority of the remedial design work is being done by performing parties, not by EPA, and EPA stays in an oversight role in that case. But of course, Portland Harbor is also huge and it's special. And so EPA is doing a piece of the remedial design work, but it still overarchingly is a potentially responsible party led site. So back in 2020, those many of you were around then, we were starting to get into legal agreements with a bunch of different design areas to conduct remedial design. And Cathedral Park, we were struggling to find someone to sign up to do that. And there were a few other pieces of the site that weren't in agreements. And so EPA at that time decided to start the remedial design process in order to keep those project areas on pace with the rest of the site. And so we started that work. And then when the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed, a lot more money came into the Superfund program. And so at that point, EPA decided just to self-fund the rest of the design rather than pausing and trying to set up another legal agreement. The best path through was just for EPA to continue that work. So we are going to take it to 100% remedial design in those areas, but then we're going to take those designs and hand them over to the performing parties who are going to implement remedial action, and they'll be the ones actually implementing our design. So we're just in there for this piece of remedial design, and then we'll be back into our oversight role. No, I'm pausing. Any questions on that? Yeah, and I can't see if people have their hands raised or anything. I hope you'll hear me,
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
EPA is undertaking to pay for the remedial design. Will they bill the responsible parties after the fact to make that good? So the
yes, we are tracking those costs, and so as a part. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, my question involves: do they get a better deal than all the other PRPs by not having to pay for their design?
No, they don't. Our next legal step is to enter into agreements with the entities who are going to perform the actual remedial action work, and the back costs are part of that negotiated settlement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then we have a question from Alex.
Oh, hey, yeah, I was curious, like, so for PRP, say like they weren't the industry to create the pollution, but then they bought the land that had a former industry pollute. Are they considered a PRP?
They can be. It depends on a lot of things. There's some deals that happen where the environmental liability is not brought forward to the new owner. Sometimes it is. It gets into a lot of real nuances around when the pollution happened and the property deals that have gone down since then.
And if that's answered your question, Alex, I see Bob's hand is up, but we also have a question from Emil, a couple questions from Emil in the chat. Do we refer to responsible parties as do you mean potentially responsible parties as responsible parties now, or is it still potentially responsible parties? Maybe what's the difference?
We still refer to it as potentially responsible parties. I actually don't know the answer to this question, Emil. We could certainly look into it for you, or if anybody else on the phone does have the answer.
Pipe up really fast. Yeah, we still refer to them. It's a great question. It's come up before, and I've checked it with our legal team in the past, and we still say potentially responsible parties, but we can get a better answer as to why that is. But it's really, like many things, I know kind of a legal reason why that is the preferred term. But we'll note that for the summary to follow up on email too.
Thank you, Laura. Second question from Emil before we head over to Bob. Just wanting some clarification about whether EPA has established their PRPs as responsibility at this time. And Emil, feel free to come off mute to clarify.
For remedial action?
I'm not sure. Emil, do you mean remedial action or remedial design?
Sorry, I just I thought that it was pretty much settled that the potentially responsible parties, the 150 or so that are now actually legally responsible parties, and that's I was just asking about the terminology. But also my understanding is if we're holding them to CERCLA regulations, as far as like paying for the fees that are attributed for oversight, then that would they're I would imagine that they've kind of passed that point of being potential, and now they are in fact legally responsible. So that's all.
There's certainly doing work as required by law. I think it is a nuanced legal issue about the potential versus actual, but we will absolutely figure that out for you, Emil.
Thanks, Emil. Thanks, Josie. All right, Bob, you're up.
Yeah, just following up on Emil's question, I would just say that I think it's really important to make it clear that they are now responsible parties. I know we've had political candidates in Portland run for office and pledge not to take money from responsible parties and then take money from potentially responsible parties under the claim that they weren't necessarily responsible parties. So I think with an election coming up, and this will probably be a big issue, it's really important that EPA make clear who has actually been found responsible at this point. And the terminology is really a misnomer. But my question is, you mentioned that EPA was going to have where there was a viable party, they would have them clean up, and they're taking over these other sites where there isn't a viable party. One of the sites you've taken over is Cathedral Park, where the city of Portland is the responsible PRP along with others. And I'm curious if you could talk more about what it means to be a viable party to this, given the fact that the city of Portland is not taking responsibility for the site at this time. It seems like they are viable. Again, a misnomer. There seem to be like a, I think most people would think of them as viable.
So the site as a whole gets designated either a fund lead site or a PRP lead site. Portland Harbor is a PRP lead site. So that doesn't change, even though we're coming in to do some of the remedial design work. There are sites that are truly, that have no viable PRP, that are wholly funded by EPA. They're designed, they're implemented by EPA, and those are the fund lead sites.
Does that help clarify, Bob?
It does. I just want to make sure that folks understand that the EPA is actually doing the work on sites where there is an identified party that hasn't stepped into their role yet. And one of them is the city of Portland.
And I think, Bob, I don't think that's a commonly agreed to stance.
And just so that there's another question in the chat too, Bob, unless you wanted to follow up on that.
Well, I'd love to hear you. I'd love to hear you follow through on that comment, because the city of Portland is a PRP, and the city of Portland is not taking responsibility for remedial design. Do I have that wrong, or am I just trying to tease this out a little bit here?
Hi, this is Eva. I'm sorry, my video can't, for some reason, is not showing. I would like to just say that, quite a few years ago, EPA did identify a number of potentially responsible parties by sending out what we call general notice letters. That was sent out, I think over 10 years ago. And we will continue calling them potentially responsible parties. And at a certain point in, another couple of years, we will be sending out what we call SNLs, special notice letters, bringing parties that we think are responsible and viable to the table to start going into negotiations for the remedial action. So at this point, there are, I think, over 150 PRPs. And in terms of the city of Seattle, they are parties to at least two areas, 11 East and Willamette Cove.
Thanks for that, Eva. I wanted to see, I know we had a couple folks from the city on the line tonight, so I just wanted to see if anybody would like the space to add anything or if we should earmark this for a future conversation. All right. Well, hearing none, sorry, what was that?
Oh, I was just, I'm ready to move on to the next slide.
All right, that sounds good. I think there was one more question in the chat for Senator Merkley's office. So I wonder if Laura, you wanted to speak to that or if we should follow up with that question offline.
Yeah, I just responded. Doris, I'll give you a call tomorrow about that one because it's a good question, but a bit outside the scope for tonight. So thank you, but let's talk because we check in with them.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks everyone for your questions. All right, Josie, back to you.
All right, so here's the timeline. So the fund lead work, we're doing the Cathedral Park area, and then there's 4 other smaller areas that we are also moving forward with design. And we're doing that all as one project, so they're all in the same timeline. As I mentioned, we started back in 2020, so we've done 2 big field events in those areas, one in 2021 and one in 2023. We are in the process of starting to get that data back now, but we are also moving forward with the preliminary design. And so throughout the course of 2024, we're going to be building that preliminary design that will come with some drawings that we'll be able to vet through the community and our other stakeholders for input. And we'll also be publishing the results of our 2023 field sampling effort in late 2024. After that, in 2025, we'll be incorporating feedback we hear and also doing additional engineering evaluations to further refine our design. So we have to go from kind of generally understanding where the contamination is to actually saying exactly where the dredge buckets should cut down into the sediment and what we need to backfill it with. So taking it from general concepts to actually some plan that you can give to somebody and they go implement it in the field. And that will probably take into the early part of 2027 until we have that 100% design. At that point, we'll hand that over to the parties who are going to implement the remedial action. And then we'll be in solely an oversight role after that. Any questions on that? All right, next slide. Now we're going to get into the project areas themselves. So the fund lead work is happening in Cathedral Park. That if someone's got their arrow, Anna, if you can show where Cathedral Park is. And then going down the east side of the river, you can see the little fund lead 11 is we also call the sliver. Fund lead 3 is right upstream of that at Triangle Park. And then in water, fund lead 10 is just downstream of the railroad bridge. And then in the bottom panel, fund lead 9 starts at Lindbergh Beach and goes down in front of the Daimler facility. So I'm going to talk about what's happening at Cathedral Park, and then Laura's going to pick up and talk about the other fund lead areas. Next slide. So Cathedral Park, the shoreline that we have now was built somewhere between in the over the span, I'd say, between 1945 and 1975. If you go look at portlandmaps.com, there's a super cool series of aerial shots taken over decades. So you can see for all of Portland how it's changed. I think the first photo in there is from 1945. In general, this area had a lot of lumber processing and shipbuilding and repairing, amongst other industrial things, but primarily it was ships and lumber. You can see in the little boxes around what was happening at each one of those areas. The one that has stayed the same for the longest is a Toyota storage yard, which has basically been a parking lot since it was filled in. Next slide. This is a figure taken out of our sampling plan for 2023. What you're looking at here, you can see the red is areas that we are sure have levels of contamination that we need to actively address. The gray is areas that we're still working to find the exact edges of. And then the colored dots are places where we took samples this fall. In general, the contamination here is PCBs and dioxins. That's really what's driving it. We do have some sporadic hits for pesticides, for DDX, and for heavy oils. But I would say primarily it's PCBs and dioxins. One thing that we're seeing in the data from 2021, hopefully, is that the area of contamination right in front of the BES lab on the right side of the page looks to be pretty shallow. We're confirming that with those additional colored dots that you see there. But if that turns out to be the case, we're thinking the contamination is in the top 1 to 5 feet, and that's an area that we'll probably be able to dredge and not have to monitor any contamination going into the future. Another thing that we talk about is what's going to happen to the piles, right? This is a public park, and it would be nice to end up with a more natural shoreline without the piles in it. It looks like there's 3 kind of sections of piles on the Cathedral Park stretch. There's one section just upstream of the boat ramp, and that's in our contamination zone, and those piles will likely be removed. There's another set. I wish I had the cursor now. Just to the left of the bridge that does not appear to be in the contaminated zone. And so the Superfund cleanup will not address those. And then there's a set of piles in front of the BES lab that is in a contaminated area. And so we would anticipate those being removed as part of the remedial action. We've had some really dedicated community members who've been part of our Cathedral Park project area working group over the past few years. They've given us some really critical information to put samples in the right places and have been helpful in connecting with the larger community there. That group, I think, has to be on hold for now. We don't have a lot to share until we have that preliminary design and the results of the 2023 sampling data. So look forward to us reconvening that group in late 2024 when we'll have a lot to talk about. Are there any questions about Cathedral Park? A pile, those big wooden posts that underlie docks that sit out in the shallow.
I always have a hard time with this. By the time.
We got you, Sarah. We can hear you.
Okay, I'm always just trying to quick slide before they go away. Okay, so I'm looking at the map, and so is that the green? If we go like I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but is this green anchors?
Green anchors is over to the left. It's underneath that gray text box. See where there's the purple crayon on the shoreline?
So what's this where I am right here?
I can't see your cursor.
Okay. Okay.
Green Acres has the purple crayon on the shoreline. And then there's
so that
you can
is
see the Cathedral Park boat ramp.
Right. But this cove, which is Green Anchors and the port, that's what we're looking at on the beach, right?
Correct. Yeah, if you're over by the purple crayon.
Yeah, so that's a mixture of the port, and it's quite a big cove, though, as people can see. It's quite a big cove. So what's the contamination level on there? Doesn't look as bad as some others.
And it doesn't, well, so it's not color coded according to how contaminated it is.
Oh.
That red is just like a yes, it's above our action levels, or no, it's not. But one thing we're trying to figure out for this area, see those blue squares? We're trying to figure out where the contamination, how far towards the shoreline it spread. And those blue dots, the cores that we're taking there, are going to allow us to understand whether that contamination goes up into the riverbank or if it's really isolated into the sediments.
But you feel like it's okay for people to be on that beach? If they're
Yes,
not digging, you feel like it's okay to stand on it?
I do.
Okay.
Anything else, Sarah?
Thank you.
So I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah.
And now we have a question from Emil in the chat. But go ahead, Doug.
Sure. Who have you selected? I'll go. Given that this is going to be the primary public access point of all of Superfund, I would love to find some semantic maneuver that we could get the pilings on the Cathedral Park beach pulled out, even though they're not technically in contaminated sediment. You could consider them a form of pollution in their own right. There must be, I mean, once you pull your equipment out there, they're never coming out. So this is our chance. Any thoughts?
I agree. It would be lovely to remove all the piles from this beach as part of the cleanup. I don't think the contamination is going to require doing that based on the sampling results that we're seeing. And so maybe there's an opportunity to leverage some other work alongside the Superfund work that would help. I know there's some really active community efforts to improve the beaches along the lower Willamette.
Does EPA do any remediation at all in the course of the cleanup?
Not on a PRP-led site like this.
Yeah, well, there's no PRP-led site here.
Well, the overall Portland Harbor is. So this small piece for design, EPA is taking, but ultimately the actual remedial action will be implemented not by EPA, but by entities who come into agreements with us to do the work.
So maybe when you're sitting in negotiations, you could offer to pull the piles out if you get reimbursed by Parks and Rec, for example.
We're open to all creative ideas.
So anyway, that's the target.
Okay.
Doug, a clarifying question from Emil. Do piles and EPA's stance on not moving them unless the sampling indicates otherwise include creosote pilings, or is that what you're talking about there?
We tested for the polyaromatic or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, in that area, and they didn't come back above our action levels for this site.
Okay, great. So that would be then no. I mean, that does also include creosote pilings.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
One more question from Emil, and then I want to make sure we leave enough time for Laura Hanna to present on her sites as well. So our last question from Emil for now is, when is the in-water sampling to be done? During what month in 2023, or did that already happen?
It already happened. And it was happening, yeah, as recently as this week. They were out there doing some final borings. We are coming back to do some geotechnical samples in the spring. And I'm trying to look really closely now to see if they're on this map. I'm not sure exactly where those are going to be.
But is that
Laura
something
might
you
know.
can talk with this group on, or yeah, Laura, if you know, feel free to hop in.
I was going to say, I know that the link, so one of the link to the supplemental pre-design investigation that we sent out The figures start on page 246 of that PDF, and in there, their geotechnical boring figures are there. And they're gonna be at strategic locations in the uplands and then also in water in the spring between like March to June of 2024.
Thank you, Laura.
We dropped a couple of links to that document into the chat, so folks can go ahead and check that out as you have time to. Everyone, if you have more questions about the Cathedral Park project area for Josie, I'll ask that you please hold on to those until the end of the presentation. We can revisit. And if we don't have time, we do have a breakout room following this meeting where we can continue this conversation. But out of respect for Laura Hannah and making sure she has enough time, I'm going to hand it back to Josie to wrap us up on Cathedral Park.
I'm done.
There you go. Thank you very much,
Right back
Josie.
to Laura.
Yeah, we can jump to the next slide, and I think we might be able to skip it, but just real briefly, right? So hi, everybody. I'm Laura Hannah. I am also a remedial project manager with EPA. I've been with EPA just over a year, but prior to that was in consulting in the Pacific Northwest for the past 10 years as a registered geologist in the state of Oregon. And I'm excited to be here with all of you. I've taken over from Hunter, who had previously been doing the fund lead areas. So yeah, this slide was just a placeholder. We can skip to the next slide. I'm going to walk through the remaining 3 fund lead areas. So we call this area Fund Lead 3, General Site History. Since the 1900s, this site has been used for a range of industrial uses. It's been a lumber production, marine services. It was a dry dock, shipbuilding, also PCBs, transformers were cleaned here. So it's had a mix of uses. In 1997 to 2008, it was owned by Triangle Park, and they owned and operated a marine services and tug company. So that's why you might have also heard us call it Fund Lead 3, Triangle Park. And then in 2008, the University of Portland purchased the property and have since been really wonderful stewards of the university and doing a lot of upland improvements on the area. You can also see that adjacent to Triangle Park is McCormick and Baxter. And so that is on the downstream end of Fund Lead 3. Many of you might know the name McCormick and Baxter. That is its own Superfund site within Portland Harbor. It was a creosote and wood treatment facility in the 40s to the 1990. And that is a site within Portland Harbor, but is completely separate for their, remedial cleanups that they're doing out there. And they have their own separate process that they go through. And we work with DEQ to ensure that that cleanup is being reviewed every 5 years through the 5-year review process. Next slide. So yeah, this is a figure of, as Josie mentioned, the current work that we did, all of the different yellow and green circles are the locations that we sampled earlier this year in 2023 to refine that first phase of sampling. And so a highlight is that this is a unique site and that there has been upland work that's been done in collaboration between EPA and DEQ. Gosh, it looks like that. I'm seeing that shoreline cap looks like it's a little off kilter from the hatching, but know that they're along the shoreline adjacent to Fund Lead 3. There was a removal action that was done in 2014, where the impacted soil of PCBs, the metals, the PAHs, dioxin were removed, and then 2 feet of clean sand was put down. And so in collaboration with EPA and DEQ, that uplands cap is maintained. And currently the in-water contaminants that we're focusing on are looking to be the pesticides, PCBs, and dioxin. Are there any questions on the Fund Lead 3 area? Well, and I guess just I did see that the university, look, Laura, I'll say one thing real quick and then I'll pass it to you. I saw that the university was in this call, and I would just say that they were really wonderful to work with. Having to get consent for access for all of the work that we were doing earlier this year, all of the upland parties were really accommodating to us coming onto their properties and doing all of their work. So thank you for that. Laura, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, just curious. I've always wondered how polluted Triangle Park is. And so now I'm finally understanding for the first time it definitely is impacted by PCBs and all the rest. And Triangle, U of P has done, according to what you were saying, a lot of remediation. But so this is part of the Superfund cleanup. And is U of P responsible? Are they the potentially responsible partner? Will they be paying for this?
No, so yeah, our work is tying into the work that's been done in the uplands. So EPA's work is focusing on the in-river sediments. This is a unique site where there had already been work done on the riverbank, which is an area in some places that we do investigate. So the university is not a potentially responsible party for the in-water component. They purchased the property, and there were negotiations between EPA and DEQ at that time of that purchase.
So it's the city, the taxpayer, who pays for this particular remediation.
At this time, this is one of the areas that EPA, in trying to negotiate with potentially responsible parties at that time, EPA decided to take this on to move this project area forward.
Okay, thank you.
And Laura, Jenny Cambier with the University of Portland just put a link in the chat if you wanted to read up on a full history of the work that UP has been doing related to the cleanup.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Jenny,
Thank
for
you.
that. Laura, we have one more question from Charlotte McDonald in the chat, and that is the previously removed riverbank area that was filled with 2 foot of clean sand being tested for stability? So that's one. And then what is the schedule of testing or checking on that filled area? Is it every 5-year testing like McCormick and Baxter, or another interval?
So we, for the in-water components, Josie mentioned that we're doing some geotechnical evaluations as part of this supplemental work. And so next spring, this is an area that we are going to be going back out and doing geotechnical evaluations with borings in the upland and also in water to evaluate the stability of this entire area. And then your second question, yeah, I think that answers it. But we'll be doing that testing, the geotechnical testing next year and getting those results. Does that answer your question, Charlotte?
She said, thank you for the update. All right, thanks, folks. Doug, go for it.
Since we're right here next to McCormick and Baxter, I can't resist. McCormick and Baxter was done a long time ago, and it was cleaned up to a lower standard than the present Superfund standards that the rest of the river's doing. How does EPA reconcile leaving unclean place right in the middle of the Superfund cleanup?
Yeah, that's a really great. Somebody gonna?
No, I was gonna say if you wanted to take that one.
That's a good question, Doug. So right now, EPA and DEQ are in discussions. EPA reviews at that 5-year review phase, and so are continuously communicating and coordinating with DEQ on that site.
Okay. I've been to a couple of tours of the site, and I think they did a really good job within the constraints of the settlement agreement for cleanup, but they did it on the cheap and they left a lot of pollution on site. I'd love to get rid of it, so anything that pushes it in that direction. I know Caleb at one time talked about considering going back into the site.
Yeah, can I follow up with you on that? That's a great question. Oh, Mady, I just saw Mady jump on.
You're at a bit of a disadvantage because you're fairly new here, so.
And Doug, you're referring to the reviews that are being done at McCormick and Baxter.
Right, they just did the 25-year review, and since the perpetuity is 30 years, presumably that's about the last one that they'll do.
No, yeah, no, they'll keep monitoring. It won't end at this point. And there's, you know, a continued effort to review the protectiveness of the remedy. And so that will continue to happen and bring it closer into line with the Portland Harbor. I'm not sure that it's been decided at this point if there are any additional actions required. I don't think that's been decided at this point, but it's certainly going to be continued to be reviewed over time.
Okay, I'll keep pushing.
Yeah, yeah, please do, please do.
Thanks, Doug. And Cassie, I do see your hand up, but I just wanted to make a quick note that just because the McCormick and Baxter site is a different Superfund site than the one that this presentation is on tonight, I'm wondering, I want to give DEQ a chance to weigh in on Charlotte's question in the chat if they'd like. But otherwise, I'd like to encourage us to stick to the Portland Harbor Superfund site just for this evening. So Cassie, do you have a question about the Portland Harbor Superfund site?
Just whether it sounds like it's a higher level cleanup than what McCormick and Baxter was. Is that the case, Maddie, that you're referring to when you refer to? You don't know?
I don't know the specifics of the McCormick and Baxter cleanup. It was done quite some time ago, but I knew that, you know, those protectiveness determinations are reviewed on a 5-year basis, and they are continually working on that. So we can certainly check back and provide more information about it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, Laura, Hannah, I think we can turn it back to you.
Yeah, next slide. Okay, so this is Fund Lead 9. This is just outside of Swan Island Basin on the main stem of the river. All of these have a little call out in one of the corners to help put you in space as to where we are. So this is an area that was filled in. It was originally the part of the Willamette River, but in the 20s through the 40s, Swan Island was filled in. There was an airport out there. There's been a lot of historic shipbuilding. And then since the 1950s, a range of light industrial uses. And of note, of the general vicinity of Fund Lead 9, the most upstream portion, actually I can take the cursor. I think I can request control. Can you see my screen? Yeah, cool. This area, if you can see my cursor, was actually filled in between this 1960 and 1975. So again, this area has been, you know, all filled in and slowly expanded over the years. And currently the upland facilities are owned by Daimler Truck, the Port of Portland, and the City of Portland. Next slide. So these are figures, again, of the work that we did for this second phase in 2023. The highlights that we want to point out is that purple line in that top figure. This is a record of decision riverbank. And so what that means is that's a riverbank that EPA at the time of the ROD in 2017 had identified as an area where there was contamination. So we are evaluating that. So all those yellow dots you see are locations where we took riverbank samples. And in collaboration and coordination with our state over at DEQ, they had identified through their source control program cleanup level exceedances downstream of that purple line. And so you can see that there are locations that don't have that purple line that we are also investigating from the conversations and input that we got from DEQ. And the main contaminants in water that we have been identifying and that from that first phase are the PCBs and dioxin and furans. Any questions? Next slide. And actually, I go back one for me just to let folks know too. I think this is a nice highlight. Sorry. This area, if you can see my cursor in the bottom right of this figure. This is an area, right? The different shading is areas where we think that, that brown is where we know that likely there's contamination and it will either be dredged or capped. You notice that it's outside of our project area, but based on the results of the phase 1 and in collaboration with other project areas, we decided that we wanted to investigate this further. Next slide. So just drawing attention to that for everyone's awareness. Okay, Fund Lead 10. So we are moving back downstream. This is a site that is entirely within the navigation channel. So this is unique to this site. It's the only site within all of the 17 project areas that's entirely within the navigation channel. There are 2 adjacent in-water performing parties. We have Northwest Natural that's working downstream, and then River Mile 7 West, Bear, Ron Palanque are working just upstream, which includes where the BNSF railroad bridge is. So for Northwest Natural operated a manufactured gas plant from 1913 to the 1950s. And then an upland party is also Siltronic Corporations. They purchased the property in 1978 and have been manufacturing silicon wafers, but they are not an in-water performing party. Next slide. So looks like a little bit of it's cut off. But based on the results of the phase 1 investigation that we did in 2021, the contamination that we're seeing in the navigation channel is actually deeper than we expected. And so this second phase of work, we have conducted borings that are deeper to delineate the vertical extent of contamination. And a couple of the boring locations that we have collected from, there has been visual observations of it's called non-aqueous phase liquid, NAPL. Think of like a tar black viscous liquid that's sticky. And the main contaminants that we're seeing in water are the PAHs and dioxin furans. Are there any questions on Fund Lead 10? Okay, let's move to Fund Lead 11.
I had a quick question, sorry, while we're still on this slide.
Yeah.
Is any area of this, of the waterfront here affected by those in-water parcels? And is this an accessible beachfront?
Yeah, so there are 2 in-water parties who are performing. You can see my cursor. So this black line is our project area. There are 2 in-water performing parties that are investigating from this black line towards the shore. So they have taken that on. I don't believe this area is publicly accessible. It is privately held.
And Laura, I don't know if you can see your cursor anymore. Just so you know.
Okay. Well, so the area from that black line towards the shore, all of that is part of 2 different in-water project areas.
Thank you. Bob Salinger, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious if any of this area is subject to maintenance dredging.
That is a great question that I do not know the answer to. Maybe.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's in the navigation channel.
So where does it go?
Where does what go?
If
The
it's subject to
materials?
maintenance dredging, where is it taken to? Does it go to Arlington, or does it get dumped on West Hayden Island, or, you know, I mean, I'm just curious if it's,
Oh,
if it's got high levels of contamination and it's dredged, how is it disposed of and how it's been disposed of over the years?
right. I mean, it hasn't been dredged in many years, right? So this area would be subject to remediation, not before it's subject to maintenance dredging. So we would actually do this as part of the cleanup and dispose of it in a landfill, a permanent landfill. We are not far enough along in the design to determine which landfill would be appropriate to dispose at, but yeah, it would just be done as part of the remedy. So it would be gone by the time maintenance dredging takes place in the future.
I guess just to be clear, maybe I'm not, but there's been a lot of maintenance dredging, EPA allowed maintenance dredging of the navigation channel over the last 20 years. There's been a lot of maintenance dredging of it, and I'm just trying to determine what was this specific area where you have high levels of contamination among the sites that has been dredged and has been disposed of over the last 20 years, or would this site have been off limits up until now for dredging?
I believe so, and there might be somebody on the core team that can speak to that, but I do not believe that this area here has been dredged in the last 20 years for maintenance.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I'll provide an opportunity if there is anybody from the Corps of Engineers on who could speak to that. Otherwise, that might be something to follow up with offline. Good question, Bob. Thank you. I'll pause just in case we want to add a little bit more detail, but
No, next slide.
all right. Actually, before we go into the next slide, Laura, there's a question from Charlotte McDonald in the chat whether the Fund Lead 10 site or project area overlaps with the Gasco project area.
It does not overlap. It is adjacent to and directly adjacent to, so it abuts. It is on the downstream side of Fund Lead 10.
Great, thank you, Laura. And then a follow-up question still from Charlotte is that there's a walkway all along that area in front of the Wacker Siltronic. Is there any potential that the walkway, excuse me, could be a public, excuse me, could become a public promenade, in your opinion?
I think that's a great idea. And I think that I know that the city has in the end, right, they're doing the Greenway initiative. And I think that, so there is a plan that most of the Portland Harbor will have a Greenway access. And it would be, it's beneficial to everybody, but I think it's also at the discretion of the private property owners.
Great. And folks,
yeah.
if you have any additional questions, I'll ask same thing that you hold them until the end of the presentation or until the breakout groups. But so yeah, go ahead, Laura, and keep us rolling. Thanks everyone for your questions so far.
Yeah, next slide. And this is the last Fund Lead area, but certainly not the least. So this is Fund Lead 11, also referred to as the sliver for some folks. So this was a cooperage until 1962, so where you make barrels and casks, and this area has been artificially filled. This is a unique site in that it is actually all in the uplands. There is no in-water aspect of it. It is a very small stretch of riverbank, and there are multiple upland parties that are doing work in Willamette Cove, and then there's also multiple in-water parties doing the in-water work. And this site is also made uniquely challenging by the fact that we have the BNSF Railroad that you can see right there. And then also how we had been talking about Fund Lead 3 being adjacent to McCormick and Baxter on the upstream section. This is also adjacent to McCormick and Baxter in the downstream section. Next slide. And so this is a project area that EPA has taken on after initial investigations done by the upland parties, where they identified PCBs, dioxin-furans, and pesticides exceeding our cleanup levels, our action levels, excuse me. And so we are currently conducted some subsurface and we're going to be doing some geotechnical borings at this location in March of 2024.
Thank you, Laura. We have one question from Doris in the chat. Has the Donis Creek source from Rhone pollution been cut off as a source of pollution to the river? Do you know?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Doris, do you want to come off mute and help clarify? I don't want to butcher your question.
Actually, I butchered it when I wrote it down. Having a hard time seeing the chat. So my question was there have been DDTs and Rhone-Poulenc manufactured a chemical similar to Agent Orange in that area, and Dones Creek runs right into the river there next to Siltronics. Has that source of pollution been cut off? Because there is a creek that runs right there. So it's no longer a source of pollution into the river. It's a highly contaminated area. It's right where the railroad track comes across there, and there used to be Dones Lake.
Yeah,
which I
so
think
this
has been vitrified.
Yeah, I know that that is an area that's been under investigation in the uplands. I don't know if there's anybody from DQ that would be able to speak to that. The status of that creek.
Yeah, hi, May. This is Dave Lacey. That creek has been investigated through Rhone-Poulenc's source control evaluation process, and there hasn't been any direct connection was identified from the groundwater getting into that creek. And the way that creek is set up is actually when it goes parallel to the highway there, and then it goes into city outfall 22C, where kind of from that coming down from the highway and from North Dome Lake, it goes into city outfall 22C. And that pathway has been evaluated from Rhone-Poulenc, but also from the Siltronic property where 22C is operated on. And the Rhone-Poulenc evaluation in their source control evaluation report determined that it wasn't a significant pathway to the river. As far as the groundwater on the Siltronic portion of the site, that's currently being evaluated under the GASCO evaluation, and I think they're in the process of collecting some water samples out of that outfall 22C which Dome Creek flows into.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for that question, Doris. All right, Laura, I can turn it back to you.
I am done. Thank you. Next slide, and I'm going to hand it over to Laura Knutson.
Thanks, Laura H. And I know I wasn't on the agenda, but I'm a special guest for these last two slides. So, and I want to say just thank you to everyone for being here this evening. It's so good to see all of you. And thanks to Kristen for putting all the terms in the chat and the links to, along with Triangle as well. So I just we're going to pivot to job training a little bit because we got two really good questions from the Portland Harbor Collaborative Steering Committee. So good reason to be on the Portland Harbor Collaborative Steering Committee, first of all. So let Triangle know if you want to join. But just really want to thank all of them for their work in addition to all of you here tonight, because they really help shape these meetings and presentations, obviously. So the first question about job training is there any intention for EPA to use the Superfund Job Training Initiative Program, which is an EPA program that we have to train people in the community and who are impacted, community members, for the work on these Superfund sites? It's a program that we have, and I think someone is going to put a thank you link in the chat. Great. For that program, if you want to learn more about it, or I can talk more about it later. But it was covered at another meeting, I know, so a previous collaborative meeting. So the question is, could we use this program to train workers during remedial action, so the construction of the cleanup, at the areas that Josie and Laura just talked about. So the areas where EPA currently, we are in the lead for remedial design, and we're doing those designs. And so the answer to this question is that during remedial action, so once we get to that stage where we're actually starting the construction of the cleanup in approximately, right, heavy caveat, 2026, EPA, we're not going to be leading those areas anymore. The performing parties who EPA has signed an agreement with, a consent decree is what it's called, that those are the parties that are going to be leading the work. EPA will be overseeing those parties, but we're not going to be in charge of these areas directly anymore. We're going to be overseeing the parties doing that work. However, right, we want to work with performing parties who are going to be doing that work, to provide job training opportunities wherever and whenever possible. So that leads into the next really great question that we got from the Portland Harbor Collaborative Steering Committee, which is, what is the timeline for when local talent should be trained and prepared to apply for remedial action work on sites where EPA has been in the lead during remedial design? So all of the sites that Josie and Laura just talked about. So again, EPA, we're not going to be in the lead for those during remedial action. That's, we again are going to be overseeing those performing parties, and their contractor will be in charge. However, the thing I really want to highlight, and we have another slide tonight that I don't go to yet, but in a second I'll show you, because we are going to be including a job training workforce development blueprint is the word I'm using right now, in the Community Impacts Mitigation Plan, or CIMP. And we welcome your feedback in that document. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide a little bit. And also there's a breakout room on it. And so even though, right, we're not in the lead on these areas for remedial action, because this is a potentially responsible party site, like Josie explained in the very beginning of the presentation. So remedial action, EPA is overseeing, we're not in the lead. But that Community Impacts Mitigation Plan has, the ability to have a blueprint for that job training piece within it. And that is something that the performing parties will be following throughout the cleanup. So I just want to say, that document's very important. And so that's why we're working with all of you. And so many of you have already contributed so much of your time and energy on it. And thank you on that document. So that being said, I want to give a little more detail on kind of the past, work that EPA has done with a lot of you on job training, and kind of that future vision, a little more detail than I think what has been provided in the past, when we just kind of very generally talked about the Superfund job training initiative, which is helpful to do too, because it's a big program at EPA and something we want to use here. But let's go to the next slide, because thank you so much. So just briefly, and this is the last one, and then we'll end and can talk more in the breakout rooms. But in the past, I just want to highlight some of the work that has been done, because I think it's really important to know what's already been done at the site. I have been here long enough now to have seen this work happen and to have been a part of it with a lot of you. In August of 2019, we did do a webinar. There was an EPA webinar to discuss the Superfund job training initiative and the Portland Harbor Superfund site. And so there's a link to that webinar in this slide deck, but we'll also put it in the chat along with those slides. So you can kind of see some of the scoping that was done back in 2019. So pre-pandemic work was done on this to kind of scope things out. And Portland, a lot of the city, state, port, like all the public agencies involved, performing parties, community groups, PHCC, many others, CAG, all of you, have given a lot of great feedback on the community involvement plan, a lot of other spaces, right, on this topic. So I just want to say the webinar happened, and then in 2019 to 2020, right before the pandemic happened, I did some initial job training scoping discussions with Portland-based job training organizations, so St. John's Center for Opportunity, Oregon Tradeswomen, Oregon Solutions, and others, and public agencies we did some scoping with too. There were some folks that came to that webinar who were interested, who were potential employers, who could maybe receive some trainees for however we do the program. And so that was, those scoping discussions happened. But what I'll say, is that was pre-pandemic. And so some of the general trend that we were hearing from some at the time, from some of those job training discussions, was that at that time, right, there was a lot, there were a lot of competition for the job training programs, actually, which was interesting, I remember. And so now that, obviously the pandemic is still going on, but we're at a different place now, like very different than pre-pandemic. And so I know that that landscape has changed. And so we really wanted, we move into the current and future category, you'll see that 2022 to present want to revisit those past scoping discussions to help inform that job training blueprint. And that's why I put a star on this one by that community impacts mitigation plan piece, because section 4.8 could change the number could change, but that section of the community impacts mitigation plan right now is focused on this topic. And so that's why, we did a pre-meeting today to kind of give an update on this, on the community impacts mitigation plan. It's one of the reasons. There's a lot of other really important stuff in the SIMP, but this is one really important piece. And so we do have an annotated outline, and you can provide feedback informally. We'll be sharing the full draft later, but you can provide feedback informally on that until January 8th of next year. And specifically that section, because one of the things that we already have in the annotated outline is flagging other large construction projects that we know are going to be occurring about the same time as the Portland Harbor cleanup. And, there's a possibility, right, that we could kind of leverage and work. We could all work together. This is a collaborative. We could all work together kind of in this space too, to think creatively about how to do job training. A really good, cool, robust pilot job training program. And then if you go down to the very last box here, you'll see about 2026, if we're looking large picture, right? That was a question. That's, when we would want to do the first job training pilot program, is in advance of the start of remedial action, which right now, we're estimating it would be about 2026 when that start would occur. And this job training this program that we could design that would be blueprinted in the community impacts mitigation plan could occur throughout cleanup construction. And so I just want to flag that too. And if you are interested in helping scope job training in the community impacts mitigation plan, we've been doing some great meetings, with many of you, and want to continue those discussions. We have some scheduled for early next year, like with the city, and been meeting with Portland Harbor Community Coalition and other partners on this piece too. But if you want to kind of focus scope with us on this, I know you all have a lot going on and are incredibly busy, but please let me know and we can see whatever you're able to give in terms of time and your mind. That would be great. So that said, I think that is it. So thank you all for listening. We can pass back to Alyssa.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. And folks, I did note a couple of questions in the chat, and I'd like to recommend that we hold those until our optional breakout sessions that will follow this meeting. Thank you, everybody, for your good questions during that presentation. And thank you, as always, to our presenters, to Jyoti, to Laura Hanna, and to Laura Knudsen for sharing all of this great information with us tonight.